Hi, this is Prison Bytes. This is Dr. Karen Gedney. I've been a prison physician for 30 years, and once a week I'm sharing a story from the inside, bringing it to the outside. This story dates back over 2 decades ago. One of my favorites, a little bit extraordinary, but I hope you like it. Imagine I start out in the prison, I'm only there a few years, and all of a sudden I get a call from the warden. And usually they never call me, unless I'm in trouble or something. But they called me and they said, hey, I want you to come over and read this inmate's I-file. Now, an I-file is basically a file that custody keeps that talks about their records and their disciplinaries, things medical doesn't really get involved with. And I had no idea what that was all about. And they basically said, well, it's too hard to explain. I really want you to read his file. Come over to the office. I'm busy. I'm leaving. I've got to talk with people. And then they were out of there. And I'm in the middle of a clinic. But I go over to the warden's office, which is an entirely different building, a fair distance away. The secretary leads me into the office and says, here's all the file. He wants you to read it. I sit down, and I'm not used to reading I-files, but I look at the picture, and I'm thinking, well, that's sort of not that impressive a guy. And I'm reading it, and the more I read it, I think, this is ridiculous. This can't be true. And it was about an inmate who had been in the California system, had become such an embarrassment to them that they wanted to give it to our system. And this inmate was an embarrassment because he kept escaping. And when I say escaping, I don't mean like he went and left the prison and then they had to chase him and find him. No, no, no. This guy, according to what I was reading, could literally get out of death row cells and then he would just sit down on the other side. This is a guy who could be at one place totally secure, and then the officers would come back and he'd be just walking down the tier, you know, sort of the hallway, but he didn't leave. And it got more and more extraordinary when you read this. There were accounts where when they would put him on a prison van, the driver would think that he would create the van to swing back and forth, and he would get scared, and the bus driver wouldn't want to be on there, and everything changed up. There were accounts from people who worked in the prison that actually saw him levitate. Now, I read a whole report from a psychiatrist who said that the guy levitated for him for a few seconds and then dropped down. And I thought, I know psychiatrists are a little nuts sometimes, but that's ridiculous. And his story was unique. When you looked at the file, he was a guy who had grown up in the South, was a white guy, and at 2 years old was taken away and put into a foster system because his mother, who was mentally insane, ended up killing his father with a hatchet. When he went into the foster system, he was adopted half a year later by a couple who took him to Tibet. He was in Tibet from the age of 2 to 18. This is all in this I-file that I'm reading. And then when you get further in the file, you saw pictures of him as a kung fu champion, as a competitor, and his physique looked beautiful, and all these extraordinary sorts of things that he did. After that, you see accounts of him where he opened up these martial arts schools, and he was charged with lewdness of a minor, sexual infractions with minors, and that's what got him into the California system. Well, California didn't want him anymore. As I said, he was an embarrassment. He would keep getting out, and even out of death row cells. They couldn't figure out how he did it. and they decided we're going to give him to this other state. And when I read this, and I asked the warden later, I said, do you think this is real? And they said, taking no chances. What we're going to do is the next day, we're going to empty out your infirmary, no staff, just you. You have to do the exam, you have to process, you have to draw the blood, and then we're going to have the psych people see him, and then he's on the bus, and we're going to send him to our highest security prison. And I thought, never in my 30 years in the prison has that ever been done. Never. So I'm only there a few years. My little heart's going like 100 beats a minute. When they bring him in, 4 officers bring him in chains, and he comes into my exam room, he sits down, and I look at him, and I'm thinking, not what I expected. He was an average-looking guy, maybe about 5'11". He didn't have a beautiful, hardcore physique, looked just average. And of all things, he had like a little hairnet on, which totally threw off what I was thinking about. And he looked at me, and this is a look that is not something I usually see in the prison. It wasn't the type of pathology I see, or maybe the entitlement or the manipulation. It was like looking at a child's eyes and a child's expression. And the I-file did say that he was mentally a bit challenged. When I asked him questions, he answered them appropriately. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is a guy who supposedly can levitate. I would love to see him do that, just once. I'd love to see that happen. And I realize all the 4 officers standing around, they are so tense. They're waiting for him to do something out of the ordinary, and they've heard his history. They are on like a hair trigger for overreacting if the guy does anything. And I see the way he's looking at me. He is looking at me like a child, like, just ask me. He wanted to show me something, I don't know what, but it was obvious that he actually wanted to show me something, and I was too afraid to ask, please levitate for me, because I knew the officers would taser him, do something or reactive that was out of the ordinary. And to this day, I regret that I didn't ask him. Now, the story doesn't end there. He had to be processed by a psychologist, and she had to be also by herself. And I asked her later, hey, what was that like for you? And she was an older, middle-aged lady psychologist. She was not, let's say, a person who had flights of fantasy. And she said, you know, he was like a child. And it was obvious he wanted to please me. And when I walked away, he said my name, and I turned back, and she goes, I don't know how he did this, but I swear he was hovering a few inches off the ground and then dropped down. And I was saying, God, I wish I had seen that. When he was taken onto the transport bus, one of the officers, who I knew as well, who was what I would consider also an officer who was not prone to making up things, when I talked to him, he said, I don't know how he did it. He had the chains, the black box, which is sort of the box around the chains so they can't get out of the chains. He goes, I don't know how he did it. We walked over to the bus, and then he turned around and he gave it back to us, the chains in the black box. And I'm thinking, all right, that's wild. Now, he was transported to this higher security prison, and unfortunately, I lost track of him. I really don't know what happened, but I always wondered. In my mind, I always considered him Houdini. And also I thought, there are always these interesting savants who can do things that are totally off the chart. The type of people who can memorize phone books, who can do complex mathematical equations in their head, the people who can hear music once and play a symphony, sort of odd savant type behavior. And I always wondered, could you have a kinesthetic savant, someone who was so off the edge in terms of the ability to do things maybe a bit faster than the eye could see? Could he have been a savant? Now, mind you, he was charged with sexual molestation. And I've taken care of a fair amount, and I mean a lot, of sexual molesters over the years. And there's all different personalities, all different feels, and there's all different rationalizations. But he truly, when I interacted with him, he was more like a child than anyone else I had ever interacted with. And I really wondered what his life had been from the age of 2.5 to 18 in Tibet before he came back into the United States. Well, just an odd little story from the inside that I'm bringing to the outside. I hope you enjoyed it. And next week, I hope to share with you another story.